You're listening to Edge of Faith, a multimedia magazine where we discuss art and culture through a Christian lens. So, Mark, Megan, thank you so much for taking the time to stop what you were doing and talk to us about your new book, Embodying Integration. How are you doing this evening?
Great. It's nice to be on. Thanks for having us, Michael.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you, Michael.
Yeah. So maybe I'll start with Mark. Perhaps we could start with you filling in the listener on the integration movement.
Sure. Yeah, this is sort of the water that Megan, Anna, and I swim in. So it's actually a good question. It's a good thing for us to remember that not everyone knows what that means when we throw out the word integration movement. But really it has to do with the relationship of psychology and Christianity, as would be true in so many fields like arts and so forth. There sometimes has been some tension historically between psychology and Christianity. At the beginning of my career, I'm 35 years into what has turned out to be a long career in psychology. But I remember that there was a lot of animosity, both directions. Psychologists not every psychologist, but a lot of psychologists were very critical of religion and especially Christianity. And it wasn't that unusual in Christian circles to hear anti-psychology comments too. And so it's been really encouraging to see this movement emerge toward integration, which is to say, how can we learn from each other? How can psychology and Christianity be part of the same conversation and learn from one another? There were some seminal parts to this. An organization called the Christian Association for Psychological Studies started probably a little over 60 years ago that started with this mission. And then a place like Fuller Seminary, they developed the first doctoral program that was an integrative program, and they worked really hard to get credibility both within the psychological community and the faith communities. And then a number of other doctoral programs have since come online, including the one that we're both affiliated with at this point at George Fox University. So it's been an adventure, and it's just remarkable. I'm 61, kind of eyeing the end of my career, and it's just been so amazing to see that there's really helpful, good conversations where we can start to get along with one another in psychology and Christianity in ways that never would have been the case 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's awesome news too. It's a wonderful thing because I think the two are really something that should be integrated. I mean, psychology helps you to learn how your brain works, and God gave us the brain so we can understand His Word, so it's all great. Megan, could you elucidate the listener on the use of conversation and how embodying integration will help the Christian counselor deal with these complex issues?
Yeah, so we use the imagery of integration conversations throughout the book. I think I'll start with an example and then talk a little bit about why I think this imagery is helpful. So for a little bit of context, I'm doing my clinical work in the context of oncology. So, recently I had a conversation with a young patient with terminal cancer, and some of the questions they're wrestling through is, did I do something so bad to deserve this? And how am I going to be judged on the other side? Am I going to be judged? Is there another side? These are the sorts of questions that we're sitting in this clinical conversation. So in that moment, in that conversation, it's not so much about having the right theory or intervention to put on top of those questions, but it's really about entering these questions and hosting a certain kind of conversation. It's about having the ears to hear the nuanced themes embedded in those questions, because really in that conversation we're having, talk about how they're making meaning in the world, about their view of themselves. Am I good? Am I bad? Their view of God. Is God wrathful? Is this some sort of divine justice? They're really working to consolidate their narrative and their story of their life as it intersects with the story they're telling of God. So there's a lot of struggle and pain and complexity in that. And that's part of what I like about this imagery of conversation, is that it gives room for that, and it's alive. It's conversation is something that's living, that's happening between two people. It's embodied. It's here and now in this moment. It's emerging from the lives of both the patient and the therapist. So again, it's less about kind of applying a theoretical map on top of what's happening in the room, and more about how do I enter into what's happening, entering into this really delicate relational space with this other human being I'm sitting with. And that's the other reason I like this imagery is one of the assumptions that I'm sure you read throughout the book is that the conversations emerging in today's context are more complex when it comes to religion and spirituality. And they're often charged. Our political and our cultural and our sexual identities, the way they're intersecting with our religious identities, they're happening in these really complex ways. And so it takes a lot of wisdom and courage to enter and host these sorts of integration conversations. And so that's something Mark and I have been talking a lot about the last couple years, particularly, is how do we train clinicians or integrators to be able to enter these conversations with wisdom and with grace. Integrators who have ears to hear these themes and talk about God when they emerge in these clinical conversations we're hosting.
Absolutely. I guess, what I took most from conversation that I thought was beautiful is that it's much more organic, that both the counselor and the person that you're talking to are at this personal level where you can interrelate with each other versus, an academic construct, which if, someone's hurt or in pain really isn't going to be very helpful, right?
Yeah. And I think that's a little bit where that came from, was a desire for that more organic, alive process to be a part of the integration kind of training, because it emerged, as Mark was just talking about, it emerged out of academia, to kind of bringing that into the embodied form as well. And that's something, Mark, I know you've talked a lot about too, with the metaphor of conversation.
I would think that it's easy for us to have a conversation about conversation, but to actually train someone how to utilize it, I guess, would be another story, right, Mark?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Megan Ann has been involved with some other folks developing a kind of module in the curriculum called Virtuous Dialogue, which is really a lovely notion that it's not about just what you talk about, it's how you talk together, and how do you hold space for differences and come alongside one another. And in the sense that the integration product is not some theoretical model. It's exactly what we've been talking about here. It's how to have a good conversation that goes into the hard places and respects the other, even if there's not complete agreement.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating. And I suppose if people want to know a lot more about it, they need to pick up the book and read it, because it's a great concept and model. So, Mark, while I'm still talking to you, perhaps what we can go into next was a chapter that I felt in my heart, which was on lament. And I've had several interviews with people that their whole book or the whole conversation was about lament, and why Christians should embrace that more. So maybe I could get both of y'all's feedback, starting with Mark, on lament and why it's important in a Christian's life.
Yeah, what a great question, and it is, I think, a really strong chapter in the book in Embodying Integration. I wanted give a bit of the backstory of the book, though, to give some context for why this is there and why it's important. So I've known Megan Anna for a long time because she's actually my daughter. And when she finished at Wheaton College, I was teaching at Wheaton College at the time, and when she finished there, she went off to Princeton Theological Seminary, and my wife, who's also a professor at Wheaton at the time, the two of us moved back to our home state in Oregon and took positions at George Fox University, where I am now. So Megan Anna's off at seminary across the country, and then she, some years later, decides to get a doctoral degree in psychology. So she starts at George Fox, and so here we are back in the same town, the same field of psychology, and very kindly, or it was just wonderful for me, she suggested that we just take a weekly walk and start talking about things that come up in life. And so that's how the idea for the book started, is we were walking around this little rural town of Newberg, Oregon once a week, talking about the complexity of life and psychology and theology, things that we love and that we've studied. And out of those conversations then came the idea for this book. And so the chapter on lament, like really all of the chapters, came out of Megan Anna's theological training at Princeton Seminary, as she was then learning to think psychologically about these theological ideas. So it was sort of new to me. I'm really fascinated by lament too, but it wasn't until I saw the first draft of the chapter that Megan Anna put together that I thought, oh, yes, this is what Christians need to be talking and thinking more about, because it's how do we feel safe enough with God that we can be honest about everything we feel, including the feelings of deep sadness, of anger, of frustration, of loss. That implies, if we're willing to sort of hold those feelings openly before God, that implies a secure, safe relationship, which is a beautiful thing. It implies that God cares enough to hold those spaces and to listen to us and to care about us still. There's something, we cite this in the book, there's something like 40% of the Psalms that have a really significant component is lament. But if you look at a modern hymnal in our contemporary church life, about 4% of our hymns, of our songbook, is lament. So it's an art that we've lost. We really don't talk much about lament, but it's very much part of Scripture. It's very much part of psychotherapy. We sit with people in their deepest places of sorrow and struggle, and if we can't sit there comfortably, we need to learn how to do that.
Absolutely. You know, I know a lot of people, I guess, feel like lament is just sad, so you're not going to grow a church if it's sad. But, you know, one of the things that hit me was, I think it was one of Megan's lines in the book that lament is actually praising God, because you're showing him that you trust those feelings and you're giving them up to him. And I thought that was wonderful. Mm-hmm. So Megan, maybe you could share a little bit more.
Yeah. I mean, this was a powerful chapter for me to write. I think this is one of the integral things that draws me to Christianity. Is the rich tradition within Christianity that speaks to how we enter suffering and how we don't enter it alone, we enter it relationally. That Christianity, it celebrates a God who's present with us amidst the suffering. This is so evident in the Hebrew Scriptures. And then, of course, in Jesus, in the crucifixion, Jesus' willingness to enter this excruciating pain. I think I put this quote in the book, perhaps not, but Shusaku Endo, he's one of my favorite writers on this. He's a Japanese novelist. He wrote Silence. And he talks about how, in doing this, Jesus became our eternal companion in suffering. That because Jesus took on the suffering, when we suffer, there is God's presence with us. And I love this imagery of entering suffering and not being alone in it. And it's also pretty countercultural in that, with modernity, with industrialization, we moved away from death. We tend to hide death in modern society. We've moved away from pain and from suffering. I think particularly, I would say, white and more affluent Western culture particularly has been vulnerable to this. We don't like to confront our limits or our mortality. And so as Mark was just talking about, this has shown up in our churches and how we kind of gloss over some of the more lament psalms and passages. And I don't think we need to be overly harsh on the church, because the church is embedded in culture, and that's just kind of where our culture has been for a couple hundred years. As an aside, I think that's partly why this cultural moment we're living in with COVID, I think that's partly why it's so difficult, because we're now having all these conversations about death and mortality, and we're confronting our limits in a really visceral way, and we don't have rituals or language to help us process that. And that's what lament offers. It offers us a form and a formfulness to place our suffering in. In psychology, we have kind of this cheesy thing, or at least I have this cheesy thing that sometimes I say to my patients. We say, name it to tame it. And it's this idea that, so when we're having an emotion, our bodies respond, especially with negative emotions. We might have this kind of icky, unnerving, chaotic thing going on inside of us. And when we can name it, when we can say, this is sadness, I'm sad, or I'm anxious, or I feel betrayed, it puts a form around it. And this is soothing. It's soothing to the nervous system, to the body, to the soul. And this is what lament does. It puts this chaotic, disorienting tear into a formfulness in the context of relationship with God and others. And so this is where I think this is part of that integration idea, right? This is where religion has something to teach psychology, because lament is teaching psychology to move beyond just thinking about grief, which tends to be conceptualized individually, to think about communal rituals and practices that give us language together to express our anguish to God and with one another. And I'm so glad this chapter's in the book, because my goodness, like a time like this, I feel like we really could use some lament language and formfulness right now.
Absolutely we could. The whole book's very thoughtful, but I guess, Mark, it's a pretty, the whole integration discussion and y'all's model and the book, it's very complex, and it's rich and full of information. And I would love to sit here for about 6 more hours and discuss the whole thing with you. But that's not going to happen. So maybe we could just leave the conversation with you sharing what you'd like us to take away from this subject and the book. And then Megan, if you'd like to follow and tell us your thoughts as well.
And you want me to do this in less than 6 hours, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay, all right. I'll try. Well, here's 4 words. That was what started the book, and what I think we'd like people to take away from the book. And it's this: let's try something different. I told you a minute ago, I mentioned the backstory that Megan Anna and I were walking and talking about psychology and theology and the complexity of life. And part of that was she was in the process of learning this sort of this integration of psychology and Christianity, and she wasn't finding it very engaging. She wasn't finding the sort of models that we built 20 years ago very helpful. And so the conversation and then the book came out of this idea of, what if we could look at this differently? What if it wasn't about sort of models that try to explain all of psychology and all of theology and somehow fit them together like a puzzle? But what if it really is about conversation, hard conversation, where we differ, where we have different ideas, but we can sit together and hold the space and care about each other, even though we have our differences? And so on one level, it's about psychology and Christianity, but if you think about it, this is the this is the cultural moment we live in, right? We're so polarized. We can't really even have conversations with one another because it all becomes politicized, and we think about whether you're blue or red or leaning right or left, and what if we could try something different? What if we could really sit and have dialogue and have meaningful conversation about whether it's art and Christianity or psychology and Christianity or political struggles or climate change? What if we could have real conversation where we hold the tension, where we care about one another, even in the midst of our disagreement? So that's what the book's about, and we try to do that in various ways throughout the pages of the book in the context of psychology and Christianity. But I think what we're really getting at is something bigger than that.
Megan, would you like to share as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Mark, you did a lovely job of summing up the ethos of the book, and I would definitely echo that. And then I think to add to that, I think I would hope that a reader would walk away with kind of a renewed sense and a resounding hope in the God that is with us, the God who is here in the pain, here in the ugly, the God who is unapologetically persistent in being with and for us. Because that theme is interwoven throughout the book, the God who is with us in the muck.
Absolutely. Well, you guys, thank you once again for taking the time to chat with us. And thank you for the book, and everybody should pick up a copy.